I'm not going to introduce myself in a lengthy manner. Still, for this talk, two additional infos, like on what I do or who I am might be of interest. The first one is, I have a kind of past in vulnerability research, even if some of you know me from other contexts. Actually, between 2006 and 14, I gave overall 6 talks at Black Hat, usually on how to break protocol or a type of appliance X or Y. And I've been involved at the time in quite a number of vulnerability disclosure cases. So I tend to say I know a bit about the space which I'm going to cover in this talk. Second additional info is at ERNW, based on one of the cases which will be discussed later in 2011, not 2012, but the case happened earlier before. We founded an ethics committee. I will provide some info how that works or what that body does later on. I just want to lay out, we have been involved in discussions about ethics in what we do and how to handle specific situations for a while now. And my intent is to share a bit of experience from those situations here with you. And by this, to maybe provide or to contribute to critical thinking in situations where you face a dilemma, like to act in a certain way or to act in another way, where there's no easy solution. Those are the situations I'm going to talk about. You might ask, okay, why is this relevant for me? And actually, or why is this relevant when involved in security research, in offense or defense, so once you're doing security work? And I would say pretty much everywhere. There is many situations. Once you look closer at them, it turns out there is ethical questions or ethical reasoning somewhere in those situations. Most commonly known as vulnerability disclosure. But I would say whenever humans are involved, whenever there is some intersection of human behavior, InfoSec or InfoSec research, or an impact on humans and on human life or society as a whole, then ethics come into play. So I would say it's relevant for pretty much everybody in the room. Very quick definition, or some additional background on me. I don't have a formal education in ethics. I have a background somewhat in literature, and later on, or in parallel, I did some math and computer science, but I didn't get a degree in that, in both disciplines. I didn't conclude the studies. At the time, it was, in my 20s, I had a good life, and I traveled the world and stuff like that, but I wasn't really interested in finishing a degree, and still I managed to be here in this, at this point of life. So if I get something wrong with the terminology, or I will give a very quick introduction into some schools of thought. If there is errors in that one, please be kind with me. Let me know. But I'm not like a formal expert or a guy with a formal education in this type of stuff. Still, very simple definition. In ethics, there is many branches, very formal, very theoretical ones, and then there is practical ethics. And what practical ethics is about is like identify moral problems in situations, understand what is at stake, who's involved, who's affected, which values might be affected, and then actually try to find out what's the best course of action. So it's not, there is an intellectual exercise involved, but it's not just about the intellectual exercise, but it's about acting. Taking a decision, I do this, or I do that, or I act in a specific way. And this usually, or at least for the scope of my talk, this usually involves a dilemma. This involves a situation where you're not sure about how to act. There is no easy solution. If there was an easy solution, in these types of situations. They could be like codified into laws, or they could be codified into, say, in ancient times in the Ten Commandments. 10 Commandments are 10 simple rules, but once you face real-life situations, it might be necessary to deviate from those rules here or there. And that's where ethics come into play. If it's easy, you won't need ethics. You can look like at the simple rule or at the law, or at some framework which gives you a direction. I will very quickly discuss 3 common or commonly known approaches or schools of thought in the ethics space. And this is just a very quick introduction. You can, and you should get much more information about these frameworks and these, as I say, schools of thought by yourself. There's some reference at the end of the talk. But just to provide you an idea, there is different ways of tackling situations. The first one is so-called consequentialism. That's, many of you say know this one, either by this name or by another name, or by, say, using it in your daily lives. This is, in the end of the day, it's about the end justify the means. So once you face a situation, you try to come up with, okay, I could do this, or I could choose another path. What's the result of this? And if the result of, say, the right-hand path is better than the other one, I choose this one. And you have to come up with a definition of what is better. And a very common example of this one is this commonly cased scenario. Imagine a group of terrorists has hijacked a plane, and they threaten to land with the plane, to crash it into, say, a stadium full of people during a football match. And then there's the question, okay, should we shoot down the plane? And a very consequentialist reasoning would be, well, if we shoot down the plane, we kill like 100 passengers, and but once the plane goes onto the stadium, it's 50K people. So clearly it's better, like 100 lost lives is better than 50K lost lives, so let's decide to shoot down the plane. The problem here is, and then you justify an action which, okay, shooting down the plane and killing people by the 10 Commandments, that would have been prohibited. But in this specific case, it's okay, it's legitimate, as it's for the greater good of saving another 49,900 lives. The main problem with this school of thought is, well, it's difficult to predict consequences. Could be the plane goes down before it hits the stadium, and then, or it could even land. Say that the passengers would be able to fight against the terrorists, and so there would be a happy ending. So your decision-taking process might be based on assumptions, and it might be actually difficult to, once you have different categories of outcomes or of people or of entities affected, then it becomes even more difficult. Like in the space of, say, animal experiments. Many people would agree with, like, oh, doing animal experiments for in the space of cosmetics, that doesn't sound right. But once it would be like, okay, we have to perform some animal experiments, so a new cure against cancer is found, reasoning might become more difficult, please note that during the whole talk, I don't really take a position. I try to avoid taking a position. At some times it might be, you might get an idea what I as a person opt for, but this is not what it talks about. It talks about making you think and introduce a certain process of thinking and tackling situations. So once there's different categories of outcomes of, say, affected entities, this one becomes even more difficult. It should be noted that in general, in a community like, say, computer or network people, let's say engineers for the moment, there is some sympathy for this. I have a background in networking in the 90s, and as a network engineer, there were tasks like fixing the network Roll up the sleeves and get a problem solved. And once you have a mindset of roll up the sleeve and get a problem solved, it's very tentative to get into a consequentialist. I have to solve a problem. I have to solve a situation and look at the outcome, and I have to act. And there is a sympathy for this one in many circles where InfoSec is involved. The main critique in a nutshell, sacrificing humans, which clearly contradicts with maybe a commandment, don't kill people, for the sake of having rain, which then brings in food for a larger group of humans. This depicts quite nicely what is the say, difficult part of consequentialism. Then there is a completely different school of thought, deontology, which is usually based on, say, very simple rules. Don't kill people, don't torture, don't do X, Y, and stick with that, regardless of the situation. This is usually, it's easier to apply this one. The thing is, it can create situations which are difficult, evidently. Don't kill people, don't kill the 100 people in the plane, but take the risk of killing 50K. A deontologist will clearly say, well, I'm not going to shoot down the plane, as I follow a rule of not, say, deliberately killing people. And then there's a third thing that you should know, which has a bit of gained a bit of ground in say, IT circles. That is principlism. Principlism is the, say, attempt of thinking about what two different, say, schools of thought and cultures have in common, of like how people should interact, and derive some general rules, and write down these rules and say orient towards these rules once a decision has to be taken. And there is one which is usually called autonomy, which means, okay, if there is people affected, respect their free will. Respect what they have, that they have intentions, and don't act, say, over their heads. Beneficents, well, do good, or at least non-maleficents avoid harm, and justice, be fair, say, find the right balance between different interests once needed. There's a well-known document from that space, the Main Law Report, which is a document created a while ago in the US. And the title of the document is like, okay, ethical guidelines for the ICT, scenarios. Well, it's not those terms, it's another one, but regardless, you can get an idea of looking at this. Whenever, say, in the space of information and communication technologies, try to get informed consent and then identify what's good or bad, and be fair while doing so. The main problem with principlism is that, from my perspective, very often it's too general. I mean, we can certainly all agree, well, world peace is a good thing. But that's easy. It becomes more interesting once you face a situation where you have to take a decision and maybe somehow hurt one of these objectives. And we will see during the case studies that this happens quite often. So once you face a situation, once you face a dilemma, what I want to, say, recommend you is to follow a certain line of questions. In the morning I said, ask the right questions, and this is a bit about asking the right questions. Once you are in a situation, in an ethical dilemma, try to identify what's the issue. What are you thinking about, or what are you talking about with a colleague or somebody else, like should we do this or that? Try to write it down. Try to identify, okay, we have a conflict which can be expressed in the following way. Then try to get the facts. Who's involved? What do we know about the situation? What are the unknowns? Who's affected? Who are the stakeholders? Is it like for the community? Is it good for a certain group of users? Is it good for like our company or for myself? Which are all, say, legitimate stakeholders, but name those. Identify who's affected. and and which values are actually affected. Then obviously think about alternative actions. I could do this or that, and once I decide to do this, the following stakeholders are affected in the following way, and I have to deviate from specific objectives. Whereas once I opt for another way of action, this would have the following consequences. Take a decision, and then usually evaluate in hindsight. Try to come up like right after the situation, say a month later or half a year later, whenever. Try to understand, okay, we did the following. Now that we know what happened after, do we think we acted in the proper way, or is there lessons learned to be fed into the next decision-taking process? There are some additional aspects to consider. There might be some power balance. Power balance means, namely InfoSec people have a tendency of like, oh, we know more than those dumb users, or we know more than those dumb people exposing their baby monitors to the internet. So it's, given we are smart and they are not, it's fully okay to hack those or to whatever, even scan those, as we are the smart guys. Please note that I deliberately use the word guys here. The internet, things that in the internet, like standards or stuff that exists, might have an origin in a certain technical community. This might be an aspect to be kept in mind. Setting precedent, like coming up with, okay, in this specific case, we consider it okay to break into a system or to scan, whatever. But this is just for this specific case. Keep in mind, other people might feel encouraged, namely depending on who you are, leading by sample, essentially. Keep this one in mind, and there is one that I consider very important. Be very careful with analogies between the physical and the digital world. This very often goes horribly wrong. But it happens very often when InfoSec people discuss about like ethical questions and potential outcomes, and then it's like, well, breaking into a system is like opening a door or say using the back door, whatever. Again, my experience is this doesn't work out well in many cases. Be careful with that one. So before we look at the case studies, well, some more things to consider. Be honest about your own, say, interest and agenda. That is part of the ask the right questions. What do I want? And take this into the like equation. And it might be helpful to discuss a dilemma with somebody out of, say, outside your say, bubble. At times, I'm not, in the traditional sense, I would say, overly religious, but I discussed actually some questions I faced with a priest who is like 80 years old, as this provided a very, very different perspective on my view of the world. So it helps to discuss with somebody, and it helps to lay out the questions. So what's the actual problem, and who's affected? And once you have to explain this to somebody, this already helps in the clarification process. Finally, let's look at the case studies, and let me emphasize one more time what I'm going to cover in the case studies, and where this, say, line of decision-taking process comes into place is usually when you face a dilemma. And dilemmas are difficult situations, or dilemmata. Don't expect to come up with easy solutions. Like once you have, after 5 minutes, a decision, it might not be a good decision. And then, say, start from scratch. So, case studies, probably the thing that most of you are interested in. We had, some years ago, the situation, we did some research on alarm systems. We found vulnerabilities in a specific type of alarm systems which are widely used in Germany. So the question was like, okay, how do we treat these vulnerabilities? Once we publish those, then it might happen, say, into our neighbors' houses. Somebody breaks in. So there might be harm for actual property or even lives. Well, people could blame us, like as a messenger, for publishing this and show up with the forks between our building. Oh, it was you who published this, and this means somebody broke into my house. So it wasn't really easy how to deal with this. And when you look at this with a, say, structured approach, it's okay, what's the facts? That one is kind of easy. Specific type of model with a specific vulnerability, which can be used to, say, put the system out of function, where function means protect, say, a building. Somewhat easy, but the not so easy fact was who's the actual vendor. Those stuff is sold in German electronics markets, but it's some Far East OEM stuff. So actually identifying who built this and who's responsible for the code running on a specific system wasn't easy at the time. As for the values affected, one could be tempted to say, well, this is a classical vulnerability disclosure. You found something, so why not report it to the vendor? But it's not so easy, given we have, say, different groups of stakeholders involved. And then again, say from a principlism perspective, what are the benefits, or what's a harm avoiding action in this case? And I gave a talk actually about vulnerability disclosure at an ACM workshop in 2015, and these are slides from that one. In the very traditional, what was called responsible at the time, and nowadays it's called coordinated, in a specific procedure of vulnerability disclosure. In the old days, there was the assumption there is mainly three entities: a finder, and a vendor, and there is an act of remediation. But those in that, say, school of thought, there were some assumptions. Which were namely, okay, the vendor will provide a patch. The affected persons, the users, will at some point have the knowledge that a patch exists, and the patch can actually be applied to cure the problem. And all these assumptions do not work in this specific case. We didn't even find out who's really the vendor. The assumption that the vendor is going to provide a patch, maybe. But how would a patch come to the actual systems? How would the users know? All this was a bit like dubious assumptions. We put some effort into identifying the actual, say, not the vendor, the manufacturer, say, of the devices. We considered going through, this is like 7 or 8 years ago, going through a Stiftung Warentest, to have like a neutral body as this affected like consumers. We wrote a blog post. You can find it. It was a free serious blog post. We didn't publish the third part, which actually described the vulnerability, and one would have been able to reproduce it. Given we couldn't really identify the manufacturer, at some point we gave up and we did nothing, which is clearly unsatisfying. As of today, it would be, I would say, mostly easy what to do. That would be go through a third organization, in this case probably Third Bund by the BSI. But we, at the time, this wasn't really an option. But the main thing here is we deviated from a common path of, namely vulnerability disclosure at the time, inform the vendor and provide a timeline and then publish. So this was a deviation from a common practice, so to say. Second case study. Imagine you as a security researcher, you tackle usually on customer behalf, a security appliance. And once you research the security appliance meant to protect, say, your customer's network, you find there is something that looks like a backdoor. And there is even main vendors from such appliances which publicly stated, oh, we will treat traffic from, or specific traffic from 5 ISAN countries different than other stuff. That can raise all types of interesting questions. Now, I used the term backdoor. In an old presentation which I gave like maybe 10 years ago, this was the definition of backdoor, and I still think this is a good definition from Warren Paxson, from a paper he published in 2000. And just let's modify this definition not to into a computer system to facilitate unauthorized access to the system, but given it's a security appliance, through the system. So there is a mechanism which you identify, which would allow specific traffic to go through this system without being blocked. Whereas the purpose of the device is, from your customer's perspective, is I buy this to protect my environment, to block malicious traffic. So one could say, at a first glance, well, this is well, it's vulnerability disclosure. You found something that shouldn't be there, so why not inform the vendor? Well, clearly this well, might not be the right way to treat this, as surreptitiously introduced. And well, a backdoor, or say whitelist, is not a vulnerability, right? Right? Depends on your perspective. A very smart guy I know once said one country's whitelist is another country's blacklist. For your customer, for the guys who paid you to actually perform the security research, the thing you found clearly is a vulnerability. But the entity to report it to, usually the old days and some specific procedure, in that case the vendor, might not be the right entity to report it to. So how to tackle this? And this one is quite interesting, as it raises two points which have to be considered in many ethical discussions. The first one is the problem of scope. Who's affected? And who are the stakeholders? Who are the stakeholders you actually want to take into the equation, who you want to protect? That's the first one, and I will get back to this in a second. The second interesting point here is that this touches reams way outside, say, InfoSec or digital security. Usually the reasoning why such stuff exists in security appliances, or may exist in security appliances, is there is a reasoning, oh, this is for national security or for fighting terrorists, whatever. But then fighting terrorists might not be what you had so far in your set of stakeholders when doing InfoSec ethics. So that is a quite interesting one. And I can avoid a warning here. Once you bring in, say, objectives which are outside the traditional realm of InfoSec, it becomes very easy for consequentialists to reason why, oh, we should do this as this is for national security, or it's for, say, world peace, or for environment protection, whatever, or for fighting crime against children. That's a very common one. Again, I'm not taking a position. I just want to make you aware of lines of reasoning and why lines of reasoning might become problematic at times. Consequentialists love citing some general objective to justify their reasoning, and to justify not just reasoning but actions. You might note I have some skepticism here, so I'm probably not the biggest consequentialist on earth. Let's take a closer look on a thing that I call scope. Who are the affected stakeholders? Well, maybe it's the internet community, whole internet where these devices are deployed. And for the internet community, which is often InfoSec researchers love doing, wow, this is good for the community, whoever community is. So for 195, assuming there's 200 countries, for 195 countries, publishing this information could be beneficial. But these 195 countries might include countries which you don't want to benefit from this. Come up with any country in your head which you think is clearly evil. What, for 5 countries, there you have the reasoning, national security, fighting terrorism, whatever. I'm not taking position here. I'm just saying you should be aware of this. Once, say, you are from a Five Eyes country, it's perfectly legitimate to say, oh, this is a good thing, as it helps us to fight the bad guys. But just be clear with that. Just be clear that you consider the existence of this technical mechanism a good thing, as it's good for the national security of your country or the perceived national security of your country, whatever. That's fully okay. But don't argue then, well, it's good for everybody or it's for the internet community, whatever. An interesting one, taking like, okay, let's look at principlism. Let's look at this autonomy, beneficence thing. Autonomy, when you remember the Menlo report, is about informed consent. Well, that's an interesting one here, right? Probably the customer who gave you the engagement to look at the devices, well, the informed consent thing in this one, that's an interesting question. So, well, the principlism thing, like doing good and avoiding harm and being fair in doing so, this somewhat fails. So you won't get a solution with looking at this set of guidelines in this situation. So the question is what we actually did. This was a speculative one. This didn't happen. I thought it was an interesting intellectual exercise. But clearly, those things do not exist in the internet. But again, to raise some points, probably this was interesting. Third one, that one we call domain controller logs. We, as you know from the active security track, we have a team doing lots of work in the Active Directory security space, and once a customer reached out to us where we had done some project work before and asked like, okay, can you help us with analyzing log files of a domain controller? And we were like, well, of course we can do. We have like the expertise, and then during the discussion it turned out, well, we are specifically looking for the stuff related to Frank Miller. Well, yeah, okay, we understand. Yeah, and you know, Frank Miller, probably we think he's the leak of some documents which became public recently, and we suspect it's Frank Miller, and he's a dubious guy anyway. So can you help us with actually getting Frank Miller fired? And we were like, well, could you please explain the objective of the project work, and where this is meant to lead to, and which is the question you want to get answered, by which type of means where we can be of help. And actually, this was brought to the ethics committee at ERNW. Given I'm one of the 2 heads of the company, one could say, okay, existing customer even, good relationship, wants to engage you for project work. What's the problem with that one? So let's have a look at the facts. The facts are not easy in this case. We don't really know. Okay, we know we should look at certain files to find evidence of some potential wrongdoing of Frank Miller, but we don't really know what's the background of, say there was probably a hidden agenda. I mean, it wasn't even hidden. It was more or less clear. But so we didn't have the full facts. Then you might ask, okay, what are the values affected? What about this autonomy, informed consent thing? This one is interesting here, as say in corporate space, there is rules and regulations and contracts. And one could say, and this is actually a clear point, say informed consent of employees can be say, not be a right to ask for based on your working contract. So the thing of say autonomy or informed consent did not really apply here. Another interesting one is like beneficence. Who's the beneficiary of, say, a potential cause of action? Say, doing the log file stuff with, by the way, an unknown outcome. I'm not sure, I'm not an expert in that space, but I'm not really sure if one could, say, prove a leakage of documents by looking at logs of a domain controller, but this might be, I might be wrong here. The thing is, who is actually the beneficiary? Is it the individual, Frank Miller, versus the organization? And here, one should keep in mind that we as humans usually have, say, some sympathy for other humans over, say, abstract entities like organizations. That's a very human behavior and very human element, which is, well, as I say, it's very human. So it's probably, one can have sympathy with that. It's just, one has to be aware of that. In such a situation where you have a conflict of interest between an organization and an individual, you can decide one way or the other. It's just you have to be aware that in general there is this intra-human sympathy thing. I really like, who of you knows Casa de Papel? If you don't, you should. In German, ich feiere die Serie. That is my favorite thing on Netflix. And clearly there is a lot of sympathy with El Professor. And usually depends on who you ask, but in general, namely after the finishing scene, some sympathy with Berlin, or Berlin. This clearly indicates, well, this is about a money heist of a significant sum. It's justified somewhat, but, well, there's this dialogue of El Professor. But it's a nice example of where humans fighting against an abstract thing, an organization, have the sympathy of somebody, of you or, say, the viewer in that case. So the scoping, who's affected actually by causes of action? Again, this is an important one. And the scoping thing is one, I had to include this slide somewhere. Some of you know that I'm not the biggest fan of internet scanning, of like, well, it's good for research if we scan for a specific port or use, say, intermediaries who do this on your behalf, called Shodan, stuff like this, as what I've seen in the past. And I have to say, actually the talk, or the occasion when I met Rodrigo for the first time, which was Hack in the Box Dubai 2007, I gave a talk on such a specific thing, like internet scanning of SNMP, and Daniel and I, who gave the talk, we later gave it at Schmuckern, and we even had a demo where we asked the cameras to be turned off as we took over a set of routers with weak SNMP credentials and abused them for a botnet, which in hindsight, I wouldn't do the same thing again, as it, well, what if one of those devices taken over for like 10 minutes during a demo at SchmuckCon like 2008, if somebody had relied on having internet connectivity at the time for whatever type of situation. But this is one where the scoping aspect usually is abused in a certain way as people doing scanning. This has been very common, like in InfoSec conferences 15, 12, or 10 years ago. And then later on in academia, many academic papers from, say, 2014 to 16 had this large-scale experiment of something, as they found it cool to catch up with, oh, we can do this scanning stuff. The thing is, usually the reasoning is, well, that's good for the community. We try to identify devices having ports, whatever, MQTT open. And thereby we show that internet security is bad and the vendors should act and everybody will be better and happy afterwards. The thing is, it might hurt actually the interest of individuals. It might be that alarm systems being scanned fall down or baby monitors go off, stuff like this. But it's very common to argue, well, again, we have a scoping. Is it more important that, say, a baby monitor is running in a certain household versus there is this specific scientific goal of understanding deployment of a certain type of devices in the internet? There it's usually the other way around. It's not the individual to be protected, but it's for the greater good. You clearly notice I'm skeptical here. This usually violates the informed consent. The people having, the dumb users having baby monitors on the internet, how could they be so dumb? And it's fully okay. We have done this all our lives as InfoSec people. We have scanned the internet, so they should know it happens. Well, informed consent clearly doesn't exist here. And there is, this is further aggravated by, we know better. We are entitled to do so as we are the smart guys and those are the dumb users, and we should educate them. Very, very careful with this line of reasoning, please, as this can have very bad outcomes. And history has shown that such a line of reasoning, knowing better than dump whoever, might have very bad consequences. You might ask what happened. Actually, this was brought before the ENW Ethics Committee, which is composed of 3 persons elected from the whole, from all ENW people, except for at the moment 2 leaders. And those are, they are elected, that means they are trusted, and these 3 people, which usually have a very different background, have to come up with an anonymous, say, recommendation, and this recommendation is considered binding for both employees. So this might mean team members of ENW might have to perform an action which they personally think is not okay. Once the ethics committee issues a recommendation, we should do this. And this is binding also for company management, which means Flo and myself. And in this case, the ethics committee gave a clear recommendation, don't do the project. And this is what happened. We didn't accept the, we didn't do it, simply. 4th one, telco training. Background of this one is a bit interesting and kind of funny. As you might know from the TelcoSec Day, which happens since a few years, there is a team at ENW which has a bit of knowledge in telco space, 3G and 4G technologies. And one day we were approached like, could you give a training on telco technologies for a group of people, like introductory 3 to 5 days, technology overview of 3 and 4G networks. And we were like, yes, of course we can. And during negotiations, it's like, okay, where to deliver it and in which format and what about the training material? It turned out they were like, okay, can you do it with training material in English, but a Russian, how do you say, co-translator? In the room. So the audience was Russian. I don't have any position here, or this happened really in this specific way. So it was, well, it's guys from, or persons from Russia, the audience, and we want to have it done with a, say, co-translator. We were like, well, this is not, this might, in general, might not be the optimal way to deliver knowledge and education, in particular when it comes to telco technologies. We don't think this is really good for, say, what we want to deliver with a training. People learn something. But if you want, we could do this. And then in the next iteration, it turned out, well, okay, from the content, We don't need this, and we don't need this, and we don't need this. We just need interception interfaces. So that is where the person who was supposed to give the training, he was scratching his head. Oh, wait a second. This is, so you're asking me to perform a training for Russians, and it's just about how to intercept networks? This was, I think, not far away, like some months after Snowden. So the guy, Hendrik, he was like, well, I don't know if I really want to do this. And we discussed this at EMW. Usually once per quarter, there is an event where all people come together and they, the different teams give presentations on their work to the other teams and stuff like this. And at such an occasion, he raised like, okay, I'm not feeling well with this. What do you think, dear colleagues? Taking a structured approach, again, might lead to interesting questions, which is, who are the affected stakeholders? One could say, wait, well, it's guys wanting to learn something, which is good, education, instructor, and that's it. And you might come up with, okay, the knowledge is going to be used and deployed in a certain context. But who's affected by this? Who's affected by this? And to be fully honest, the next question could be like, well, do I care? Would the, say, decision-taking process be different if it was, say, the affected potential subscribers of telco networks? Does it play a role? Which country is, say, involved and affected? Does this play a role in your decision-taking process? So the scoping thing, again, becomes very interesting. Would you care if, in whatever country, come up with some country which you consider clearly evil in your head, and then would you care if in that country, say, the knowledge which you provided would be abused in a specific way or not? Or would it make a difference if it was your most favorite country in the world? So the scoping thing is interesting. The values thing is interesting. Well, informed consent might be interesting. What are benefits? Clearly, in such cases, there is this line of reasoning, oh, we need some capabilities, or we need some knowledge, or we need some technologies, like stuff that is used on devices, which is brought to devices, and which is capable of intercepting traffic of individual devices. This is used and this is needed for the greater good of fighting terrorism or keeping democracy in a stable state, whatever. So again, what is this beneficial for? Discussion might be interesting, but in the end of the day, this is about a training event. Is it of your concern what could happen with things that you delivered through training? If I ask this question, I could even, as the founder of Troopers, I could ask, okay, what if, say, knowledge which is provided from this exact stage on attack and research would be used in specific countries for specific purposes which I do not consider consistent with my value system? Would this mean I stop running Troopers? So who's affected and what are the benefits? This is an interesting dimension in this one. Again, you might ask what happened. We had already committed in the first place, well, we will deliver the training. There was already in contract. So we did the training. We founded the ethics committee as we wanted to relieve like the individual person from the decision-taking process. We were like, okay, well, this person wasn't feeling well with, I don't really want to give the training, but I understand. Well, my company has already signed a contract, and as we say at EMW, pacta sunt servanda, and that is a contract. We had already committed to doing this. what this could create a conflict of interest between the individual and the organization. And we wanted to relieve this, or to say formalize this. So here's this body called the Ethics Committee. Bring it to them. Those are reasonable persons. Those have been elected. Those are trusted. Those are trusted as for their capability to come up with a proper conclusion. And once they do with a recommendation, it has to be followed either by, say, management or by an individual. Of course, it's possible, in general, to take a decision on your own, being part of an organization or being part of a greater group, which might not just be your organization, it might be your, the village you live in, or it might be your family, which you can even come up with decisions which violate, say, the law, superseding usually corpus of rules, which then is civil disobedience. That can be done, but I would recommend civil disobedience. Keep that for cases where you really think those are worthwhile. Not sure if, say, risking, say, losing your job. I mean, once you come up with, okay, I'm going to take a specific course of action, which is rejecting performing a certain training. Can be a decision on ethical grounds. It's just be aware of, say, the affected stakeholders and the consequences, and take this into the equation. And again, this was the reason why we founded this body, to come up with a solution for potential conflicts of interest. Last one. That's again, I think, quite interesting one. We were approached by an, say, by an entity, asking like, okay, can you guys, you have a reputation of doing excellent security research. Can you research a specific, say, module of a common smartphone architecture? Which at the first glance sounds interesting. And it's from E&W perspective, this is like sponsored research. Like performing research and getting money for it. This is probably what most of you, especially say young and freelance researchers, said, that sounds like a dream job. But then there was like, well, it's not, we do not just ask you to perform security analysis of the thing, but please come up with proof of concept code. How this can be, if you find something, we expect you to come up with proof of concept code, how to exploit it. At that point, we were like, okay, why? And now bring into the equation that the entity who approached us was from a country which, say, in Amnesty International's human rights reports, has quite some coverage. But then again, this would have been a lucrative engagement, research by itself. You can say, well, analysis, what's so wrong about analyzing something? And looking closer at this thing, one could say, oh, okay, this is a bit the direction of, say, the traditional vulnerability or exploit sales debate. What makes this more interesting in this specific case is they asked for proof of concept code. They didn't ask for like, can you come up with an exploit? But we just need proof of concept code, which by the very definition, proof of concept usually is an intellectual exercise. Proof of concept, once you're stuck with the words, it's like proof a concept. That's not really what you'd say, okay, this is a fully working exploit. But the intent behind this might have been, well, the opposite. I skipped over this. At ERNW, we have, which is our position. I'm not imposing anything to anybody here, but we have a very, say, strict deontological stance towards, say, selling vulnerability information. We don't do that, regardless of the entity reaching out to us. Another thing which is interesting in this one is once exploit code exists, that usually modifies, say, the balance of powers, as it entitles some entity, well, to execute code on another entity's systems. So the power balance or imbalance thing can be interesting. So let's perform the structured approach. Well, the facts, we don't really know. What is the intent? What is this proof of concept code to be used for? Well, but on the other hand, it's just proof of concept. It's not, well, it's not a fully working explode or whatever. It's not, it can be used. So why care? And in the end of the day, one could say, well, it's about the money, which again is fully okay. You just have to be aware of that. I'm not, say, judging any decision-taking process. I'm just recommending put on the table what's there and understand why you take a decision for one way or another way. And this is a particularly interesting one at EMW. We are a well-established company. We can take decisions with a certain financial stability. I don't judge anybody who comes up with, well, I have to feed my family, I have to pay my rent. I somewhat feel this doesn't sound right, and I don't believe this proof of concept thing, but still I need the money. I was young and, well, that's okay. It's just, oh, that can be okay. Is my son here? That's not okay. But still, think about it. Ask the right questions. Getting back to my opening in the morning, ask the right questions in such a case. Informed consent probably would not exist, but then again, it's POC, right? Benefits, for whom is this beneficial or not, might be interesting. Who are the stakeholders? Do you care about, say, dissidents in a Middle East country? Is that of your concern or not? Be clear with your answer to yourself. Look into the mirror. So, well, again, it's maybe entities versus individuals, but once it's about entities, it could be about national security, fighting terrorism, removing evil from the world. So it's not an easy one, and there is the financial aspect. What happened? Actually, I merged two case studies into one here. There was this, can you perform security analysis and provide proof of concept code? That was, it didn't even have to be brought to the ethics committee, as we were clearly, it was clear we were not going to do this. Then the same client asked, okay, can you help us with coming up, like protecting our telco infrastructure? Which then, I mean, this was about like defensive work. Still the question would be, okay, in this country, do we want to do this? Based on their, say, rating, their assessment in the Amnesty International report. But this was for a very different type of work with a clearly defensive direction. We were open for that. It didn't happen anyway. So we didn't come to the point where we had to take a final decision, oh, are we going to do this? But there we had, given the defensive nature, a more open attitude. For the first thing, we rejected this. We were like, we are not going to do this. Conclusions. I hope I made you aware that in many circles of your, say, InfoSec life or future career, ethical questions can play a huge role. Be aware that consequentialist reasoning, like I do this because it's for the greater good or less people die or whatever, can be greasy ground. Be careful with that one. Think twice ask the right questions. Try to understand who's affected, what your values are affected. Reflect your own agenda. And in the end of the day, it's about critical thinking. And critical thinking is effort. And I will conclude with this one, going back to the Parzival from the morning. Parzival is one, say, example of a larger group of opera from the Middle Ages, where the Round Table of Arthur is involved. And there's two other ones, namely Eric and and Evine. And in those, there is now it comes a very German term. You will get to know those non-German speakers and even the German speakers to get to know a very German term from medieval literature research, which is a Doppelkursusstruktur. In those two, namely the other ones, a bit in Parzival as well, there is a Doppelkursusstruktur, which essentially means the protagonist at some point has reached what he was, and in that case, it's all these three are actually he. What he was in the medieval ages, like this thing of balance, and there was a specific, say, view of the world. But so the protagonist reaches a point where he has achieved everything. He's married the daughter of the king, which was promised to him during the tournament. Informed consent wasn't a well-known concept at the time. And is like at the court, and everything is nice and fine. And then something unexpected happens, and he's thrown out to the world again, and has to do the whole thing again. And that is usually much more tedious than when he initially reached the goals which he was set out to achieve. And this is called the Doppelkursus. So there is two stories. One where in the first, it was easy, and in the second part, it's not so easy, like from the corpus of literature. That one is the much bigger part. It's much more difficult, but in the end of the day, a state is reached which is sustainable. A state is reached which is set out to last. And this is a bit like as it's with ethics. You can come up with easy decisions and conclusions like, well, I do this for these reasons. What I recommend, and what I think is needed, is take the more tedious way of critical thinking, asking why, asking the right questions. Who's affected? What are the values? Why do I want to act in a certain way? What is my own agenda? And then that's where ethics is needed. Thank you.